Out over their intermediate and longer term, it's all about preparing for an open access clearing model where multiple exchanges can compete while accessing a consolidated and single CCP and CSD on fair terms. In the case of Brazil, that would mean CBLC in all practicality. And at the same time, issues do need to be addressed to support a multiple exchange environment. The market regulation function of the BSM and how that evolves in a multi-exchange setting being a simple example. But also in other aspects of market structure, such as market data and best execution. Again, DirectEdge is completely prepared to fulfill all of its responsibilities on an independent basis, whether for regulation or other aspects of exchange obligations under Brazilian securities and other laws. And we're really just speaking to what the optimal result may be for Brazil in terms of transitioning to that environment. With respect to best execution, again, this is a principle and a framework that's already in place, of course, under Instruction 505, and it simply needs to be evolved in the context of a multiple exchange environment. And I think, as we'll talk later on, there may even need to be some guidance given to exchanges itself in that regard. So going back to our perspective, and I think we've already spoken to, hopefully it's in sync with what's on the monitor in front of me. So we generally agree with the report and its conclusions, and we don't necessarily think it's a productive use of our time to dwell too much on particular details of the report and the rest of our remarks. And we took heart from the report in the sense that its recommendations were very consistent with the approach that we've always intended since pursuing this project and announcing our intention to do so in Rio in November of 2011, to operate and register as an exchange under 461 at the outset, to clear and settle our transactions through CBLC, and try to coordinate as much as possible with BVMF and other market participants to facilitate a smooth transition to competition amongst exchanges. And I think also the spirit of the report is consistent with the principles that we've applied in pursuing this project. To introduce competition, but do so in a way that incorporates what makes Brazil unique and a leader among global capital markets. To act as a respectful, responsible, and positive member of the market from the outset, and not focus on what we perceive to be wrong with it, because frankly, absent the absence of competition, we think there's very little. But simply to add what we think we can bring to it to help it move forward and even further. And to, wherever possible, avoid the introduction of incremental systemic or operational risk, so brokers and investors can take advantage of what we have to offer in a way that's as seamless as possible. So, how do we move forward? I think it's important that regulators and policymakers make clear guidance, right? Market participants need to be in a known state as to whether or not exchange competition will come to Brazil. There cannot be, or the perception of there being, endless debate. To prepare and transition in a responsible, efficient manner, market participants need appropriate time to prepare and establish frameworks that avoid needless duplication of resources. Again, this doesn't necessarily mean that every single detail of a market structure post-competition needs to be articulated at the outset. But the framework and the path forward must be made known and certain in the minds of a broad set of market participants. This approach, in our view, should allow for the introduction of competition. It should avoid unnecessary conditions in an evolutionary process. New exchanges should not have to have their systems set up and sitting in a data center waiting to be turned on the day they file their exchange application. Right? The introduction of competition is an evolutionary process, and standards will need to be met. Justification of the resources and approaches to meet those standards will have to be clearly articulated in the application process, which we fully intend to do. But the evolutionary nature of new competitors arriving in the Brazilian market should be understood, and artificial barriers to entry in that process should not be introduced. The primary operational issue for any new exchange is access to CBLC. That must be addressed as quickly as possible, and we'll speak to some of our experiences there. And where there cannot be cooperation, there needs to be involvement by regulators and policymakers to facilitate that. I think all implementation principles should take into account the cost-benefit ramifications of such approach. And as we said earlier, continuing to consolidate utility functions, which really should not be the basis for competition, and to take a more structural, principled approach rather than hard and fast requirements for market participants that may impede each participant's ability to develop a solution for them that works as efficiently as possible, all the while ensuring that we remain with a market of the highest integrity from the perspective of supervision and regulation. So, in speaking about how regulation is essential in facilitating competition, it's quite clear that without clear support from regulators, competition will not come to Brazil. The investment required for new entry would be discouraged by the unacceptable risks of an uncertain regulatory environment. Incumbent market participants would unlikely to see the benefit of voluntary coordination, and market participants would be wary of making not only the investments, but the expenditure of the analysis and strategic planning absent clear certainty. Nowhere is this clearer in DirectEdge's experience than the need to ensure access to the existing CCP and CSD, CBLC. The Oxera report, I think, said it very well, in that entry by a trading platform would be difficult, if not impossible, without the cooperation of and access to CBLC. We have, from the outset, sought as an operational principle to enter the market in Brazil on the premise of clearing and settling our transactions through CBLC. We have tried on multiple occasions to negotiate access to that facility on fair and reasonable terms commercially, and have been unsuccessful. So again, I think that indicates that absent a broader mandate from regulators about the importance of that access in the introduction of competition and the importance of competition itself, where the ultimate result is likely to be, absent that involvement. And I think, again, that's not to completely place the introduction of competition over all other priorities existing in the market, many of which would advance the Brazilian capital markets, whether from a stability or from a cost or from an operational sense. We believe, and we'll speak to, that clear timetables can be set for open access to CBLC while at the same time balancing those competing priorities, and to minimize disruption to BVMF in the process, most especially their, I think, well thought out project to integrate their current clearinghouses. And these things can happen in parallel, right? So other efforts can be undertaken at a similar time to prepare the market for competition in a way that I think would be quite